Well, in the past 3 months, there has been a more than 66% increase in murder compared to the same period last year. Police Minister Bheki Cele has presented the crime figures for April through to the end of June this year. In that quarter, over 5,700 people were killed. Over 10,000 people were raped, reflecting an increase of over 70%. Over 3,766 rape incidents took place at homes. 487 rape cases were related to domestic violence. For some analysis, I'm joined by Lisa Vetten, an activist and researcher, to talk to us about that situation. And in a moment, I'm hoping to be joined as well by Chris de Kock to just make sense of the figures that are coming through. Lisa, thank you. So the word used by the Minister Bheki Cele is catastrophic. He says ordinarily these figures would have been catastrophic, the increases that we are talking about, the double-digit increases in contact crimes and the likes. But he says they are not catastrophic because we are comparing with the skewed picture from last year. And if we compare with this picture that's not skewed from 2019, well, it's not catastrophic. Do you buy that?
Yes, he's quite correct. I think one needs to compare apples with apples and not apples and pears. So some of the increases definitely explained by the fact that last year, the first quarter was entirely artificial. It was at levels 4 and 5 of the lockdown, which restricted movement. And I think we see a great deal of crime is accounted for by men's violence towards each other outside the home. So that was artificially reduced. Now that those kinds of limitations were no longer in existence, so it's not surprising we've seen the increases that we've seen. But that said, I think if we look at murder is very worrying. It's been on the up since 2012. There isn't a single year in the last decade now where we haven't seen murder increase year on year. So there's a lot to be worried about in relation to murder. I think the increases in rape are also of concern. And I think what this might be telling us is starting to point to some of the longer term impacts of the lockdown. I think some of our robbery figures as well. We've really got to be wondering now how the greater hardship, the greater economic difficulties, what exactly that's going to be, what role that's going to be playing in driving crime. And we've got to add it to, I think, the impact this has had on the police and their ability to police effectively, and wonder what that means for their ability to deal with rape and domestic violence from a policing perspective going forward. So there's a lot to be very concerned about here.
Yeah. Lisa, let me stick with you for a moment before I bring in Chris de Kock into this conversation. Let's talk about the violence directed at women. From those statistics, we pick up that some 15,000 cases of what's called domestic violence, meaning that the victim and perpetrator have a relationship. And the main occurrence of these assaults was at home, either at the home of the victim or the home of the perpetrator, public places and liquor outlets. It again comes back to that all-of-society approach, doesn't it? To what extent does policing as a component of that all-of-society approach to responding to violence against women in our society, to what extent does policing factor in the figures that we are seeing?
Policing is important in relation to domestic violence. It's important when women have applied for protection orders. So the police are key to preventing further violence by enforcing protection orders. And sometimes their enforcement of protection orders can really mean the difference between life and death. So the police are really important in that respect, in taking women to shelters, for example, to ensure that they can get to safety. And the other reason why they're important is when the police don't intervene, it sends a message that this is not really terribly important violence. Nothing to get too excited about. So a police response that is effective and appropriate sends both a broader community message, and it also removes from circulation those who are dangerous and protects women's lives. So they are part of the response. They're not the whole response, but they're a very key and important part of the response, just like the courts and the hospitals.
All right, let me bring in Chris de Kock. He's the former head of the Crime Information Analysis Center, just for his perspectives as well. Chris, thank you for joining us. So a quote here from the National Police Commissioner Thulasizwe Simelane says, we are not yet losing the battle. The battle is still in progress. What's been released now is operational statistics and not strategic statistics. And the emphasis as well coming from the minister that these are quarterly figures. Judge us on whether or not we are making progress towards halving or eliminating violent crime. Judge us based on the annual figures as opposed to quarterly figures. So the suggestion is we've had a bad quarter. Do you buy into that? I see you shaking your head, suggesting that you don't buy into this narrative.
Now, unfortunately, I must say there is no way that I can buy that explanation. We are losing the battle since 2011-12. From there, you know, if you look at murder, murder is the most reliable crime figure that you can get worldwide because bodies can't lie. The fact of the matter is we had every year from 2003-4 right down to 2010-11, we had a systematic downward trend on murder. So it was reduced every year. Then suddenly in 11-12, somewhere around there, something happened. And since then, as Lisa have already pointed out, we had a constant increase. And if we now take this abnormality of comparing with last year, which was a total abnormal situation, and we compare with the year before that, 1920, then we still have a 6.7% increase in murder. And also in our robberies, in all our robberies basically, if we take the total category robbery aggravated, we had a 13.1% increase. Now that is just, and it constantly happens since 11-12, which means we are losing the battle. We are actually losing the war at this stage.
Yeah, and the points that you make, to what extent, Chris, if I stick with you for a moment, to what extent does the failure, whether necessitated by resources or not, is another debate, the failure to have new recruits for 2020 and for 2021, coupled with the retirement of police officers at age 55, to what extent does that come into the equation, that we basically have, in a way, a high attrition and not so high in terms of adding new resources, human resources? To what extent does that place us at a distinct disadvantage?
Now, look, all of the factors that you have mentioned, resources, as the minister have mentioned, the fact that there's no new recruits for 2-3 years, that there's people leaving the police service because of their age. But my retirement age is actually 60. But in any case, that all plays a role because you lose experience on the one hand, and you don't bring in new people, new blood to gain experience. The fact of the matter is, I think there's some other explanations. You know, we can refer to resources, we can refer to a lot of things, money and everything. But I mean, the same factors existed in the period 23-4 or 2-3 up to 11-12. The police, I was there at that stage, and I mean, the same problems basically exist. But there's a difference. And I just think the difference is this. Policing, especially when you come to things like robbery, even street robbery, which the police never refer to. They never refer to street robbery. But if you look at the explanations for murder, it seems this is one of the biggest contributors to our murders. The people killed in the poor areas, on the transport lines to the poor areas, on their way to work or from work, they are getting killed, and that is the constant increase in our murders. And there you need visible policing. You need visible policing, police who are there based on the information which is analyzed daily. That is the success story of the decreases in the Celebi period and in the Cele period. I call it usually those two. I mean, where did you see bigger decreases in a thing like carjacking than during the World Cup? The reason for that was intelligence-based policing. And then suddenly after that, when basically in the time when Commissioner Ria Pierga appeared in the police, these things just got lost, it seems.
Lisa, let me give you the final word. Let me suggest that it will be impossible to reduce violence directed at women, assaults on women, rape, and the likes, in the absence of a downward trend in overall contact crimes. And I think that speaks for itself. I mean, for instance, this example here of the April to June 2021 number of rapes recorded, rape incidents recorded, 10,006. Of those, they took a sample of some 5,439, and it revealed that out of that 5,439, 3,766 of these rape incidents took place at the home of the victim or the home of the rapist. Again, it comes back to that all-of-society approach. Take all of that into the picture and add the various strategies that have been announced, the big words, the summits and the declarations that have been signed in the last 2 years. What's the picture looking like for you? What's the trajectory of these particular crimes?
You know, a summit is a piece of paper. People have to do the daily, ordinary work of policing. So, for example, 40% of rapes are stranger rapes in South Africa. What that means is that, but the problem is that the police aren't arresting those stranger rapists. When you add that to the failures that we're seeing at the DNA laboratories, for example, and which means that DNA rapists, that serial rapists are not being identified, that they are being released to escape to another province to continue their work, then you can see that the role that policing is playing, unfortunately, in not curbing rape. So yes, let's have a whole of society approach, but that doesn't stop the police from having to do the job they're supposed to do every single day. And no matter of summits changes what they have to do on an everyday. It doesn't change. The courts still have to do what they must do. So I think we don't need to wait for the president to make grand statements. The courts, the police, to do the work that's laid out for them in the various sets of legislation, work that they're trained to do. And if they do that, we will see some kind of differences as well. They can't just step back and say, oh, it's the rest of society's problem. It's their problem too. And they have a role to play in prevention, and one wants to see that starting to happen.
Yeah, all right. I've got to thank you both for coming through and joining me. And Chris de Kock, I remember that specific period that you talk about, the so-called Cele years. And I always look at a figure like cash and transit heists, where cash and transit heists were almost non-existent by 2010, thereabouts. It had come down that significantly. But now we keep adjusting the new normal. You add 8 more this year, etc., and the situation is deteriorating. Lisa Vetten, I've got to thank you as well. And Lisa there refers to the situation at the DNA labs and the situation around the processing of DNA evidence. Well, a few weeks ago we had that conversation. I can tell you now we're trying to line up a right of reply for the board that is in charge of the DNA labs and fixing that particular problem. We will be trying to line that up to hear from them, because that's part of the equation.